and to say to your Father, I believe that you are bigger than I, that you're more powerful than I, and that you want me to be part of your plan. So I give my life to you to be part of your plan. I receive your forgiveness through Jesus, and I give you me right now. You can do that today. And if you've never done it before, I invite you to do it today. Put a check mark on your card and say, that's me. And I'm going to catch up with you, and I'm going to follow up with you, and we're going to go out and have some coffee or something and talk about what the next step is for you to grow in that. But I've already taken up too much time. We've got a few minutes left, and I want to just ask if we had a couple questions that maybe we can interact with, and then we'll invite the band back on up and take our offering and be dismissed for the day. Oh, here. If God knows the future, why did he create us if he knew we would fall? See, this is part of that whole thing that God knows a whole lot more than we do. So if I'm talking to my children, I'm going to tell them they should eat their broccoli, right? I know they don't want to eat the broccoli, and I know the broccoli doesn't feel good to them. I know the broccoli tastes gross to most children and most adults. I know it's that way, but I'm still going to tell them to eat it. Why? Because somewhere, some scientist has done some research that vegetables like broccoli reduce your chances of getting cancer. And I'm like, well, that's a good thing. And broccoli has other beneficial things to it too. But that's only because I know more of the story than they do. And here's the only answer we can say for things like this. God knows more of the story than we do. He knows that there's a better future where he lets people make free choices than where he creates robots who never fall. God knows there's a better future in a world that he created than in a world that we could imagine with perfect people who never do anything wrong. There's a better future. And so that's one of those aspects where we need to trust him. Make sense? You guys have another one? If the Bible doesn't discuss a particular issue, is the answer always, it's God's will? Well, that's a good one. What do we do if the Bible doesn't discuss a particular issue of morality? Okay. Well, there are two ways you could take this question. One way is, here's a bad thing that happened, and the Bible doesn't talk about why that bad thing happened. Maybe we should just say it's God's will. Okay, so like the Hurricane Katrina or the tornadoes in Joplin or the Haiti earthquake, things like that. What do we do with that stuff? Do we just slap it, it's God's will, because, God's in charge of everything, it's God's will? Yes and no. Is it God's will that those people in Haiti experienced all the tragedy that they experienced? Does God hate those people and love us so that he spared us when he just destroyed all of them? How you ask the question of God's will makes a big difference. Because see, if you say, does God want those people to perish forever? No. The Bible tells us clearly he wants them to be saved just like he wants you and me to be saved. He loves them. Does God want to preserve human life at all costs? No. God is not interested in preserving human life at all costs on this earth, because he knows there's a better future in mind for everyone who believes in Jesus. And so he is patient with some people, letting them live longer than they should because he's waiting for them to receive Jesus. And other people he allows to die sooner than they should because he knows they've already received Jesus, and other kinds of reasons too. Human breathing and eating and sleeping on this planet is not God's highest priority. So God is okay sometimes with things that we think are atrocious, because God knows eternity is on the other side of human earthly breathing and eating. Does that make sense? And so we ask the question of, here's this bad thing. Can we say that's God's will? And on the one hand, yes, it is God's will, because he's got a big plan. He's got a big future. But on the other hand, is it God's will that he tortured that particular person? No, God doesn't want people to experience that kind of stuff, but that's part of this bigger world that is eventually going to be healed. God's big plan is to heal the world and make things right. God's small plan is to leave room for human interaction and choice. And that's a huge conversation that we could have. But then the other part that we should address with that is, if the Bible doesn't discuss a particular issue of like morality, let's say there's a person who has a particular sin in their life, a particular temptation in their life. Can they say, well, it's God's will I'm like this? An alcoholic, can they say, well, it's God's will that I'm like this, and I should just enjoy it. I should just live the way God made me? Well, no, because there are biblical guidelines, even though that particular person's name isn't in the Bible. So it's a big question, and I don't have time to get into all the details of how to determine God's will just because it's huge. But let's take one more, and then if you have any more questions that you've texted in, they've gotten to me by email, and so I'll address them sometime this week. Can you expand the reality of God's power and righteousness as it applies to being in or outside of God's will? Okay, that's really interesting. Being in or outside of God's will. If you married the wrong person, you're outside of God's will and you're going to hell, right? No. It's again that question of God's will. Being in or outside of God's will is something that you don't determine, because God has this big will that you're all in, whether you're following Him or not. And God has a direct will for you that says you need to follow me. And there you can be in or outside of that will. You can be in or outside of God's will for you. If you reject Jesus, you're outside of His will for you. And so then God says, well, I've got a bigger plan in mind, and this person is not contributing to my bigger plan right now. So God allows some things to happen sometimes. I can't get into all the details of that stuff either, just because God's will is just way too big for us to comprehend. But the reality of God's power and righteousness simply boils down to this. God always does the right thing, and God is big enough to make it all happen, even if we don't see it right now.